few years ago, the world of the West was, it seems to me, a very different place than today. So much has changed in every part of life. I have all sorts of questions, but my quandary boils down to where are we now as a society and where are we going? Joining us to help us find some answers is philosopher and ethicist Dr. Piers Benn. Good evening, Doctor.
Good evening. Hello.
This is a topic that fascinates me because, you know, during the pandemic we were nudged. We know that it was admitted that we were being nudged by behavioural scientists to behave a certain way. Are we being nudged to have a different view of right and wrong, or am I just being paranoid?
What do you mean during the COVID pandemic, or
yes,
just
where our behaviour was being intentionally nudged by the adverts we were seeing and the propaganda we were hearing, and I wonder if we're being nudged to accept a different morality.
Well, I suppose the question there is what is nudging and what's actually wrong with it. I mean, morality at its best is a rational process. It's not something you take on authority, although, not ultimately something you take on authority, though there may be authority you should follow. If you're being nudged in the right direction, you could say, well, you know, that's what the law does, that's what public opinion does, that's what your neighbours do. Your neighbours nudge you in all sorts of directions that may be for good or ill, in ways that lead you to behave in certain ways without necessarily thinking them through. So if by nudge you mean influence, are we being influenced to form certain moral views? That's not necessarily a problem. I mean, maybe we need to be influencers. I mean, a moment ago you were talking about how, you know, morality is broken down and maybe schools should be stricter or whatever it is. That's a kind of nudging. In fact, it's more severe than that. It's threats of punishment. I mean, the question is, is our rationality, is our ability to think about moral questions being undermined by... And that's a really interesting question you're onto.
What would you say is the answer to that question?
Well, it depends. It depends on the context. It depends on what we're talking about. I think when it comes to, say, public health, and you mentioned COVID, I think we were... I mean, it's a very complicated issue, what we should have done, and nobody really knew because, you know, so much was unknown in the early stages. But we might have been nudged to be rather unreflective about how to balance the various goods at stake, so public health versus individual freedom. And maybe we were being nudged or sort of bullied, if you like, into a public health direction without sufficient thought. But I don't think the problem is exactly nudging or what I might prefer to call influence. The problem might be the direction you're being nudged in, and whether you're being allowed the capacity to answer back and to reflect.
Aren't you in part there presupposing a benevolence or a benign authority that's doing the nudging? You know, it's all very well if you're being nudged by a benevolent entity, but what if you're being nudged by an authoritarian, totalitarian entity that's working in favour of vested interests?
Well,
not yours.
That's the problem you find in all sorts of societies. You're bound to find it. You find it in there are good schools and bad schools. There are schools that nudge you in bad directions. There are states and societies that nudge you in bad directions. I mean, the most extreme example would be, you know, the Soviet Union and the other countries where people were nudged to think in a certain way and weren't given the means to think in other ways. I mean, the real question about things like, I mean, let's call it indoctrination, if you like. It's in the same area. I mean, indoctrination operates by depriving people of information and by bombarding them with the preferred information while undermining people's ability to think these through things autonomously.